The business card landed on my father-in-law's kitchen table like it had been waiting there all along. My brother-in-law Stuart set it down between the coffee mugs, face up, deliberate, while Rhett leaned back in his chair and nodded like they'd just closed a deal. "Grayson Realty," Stuart said, tapping the edge of the card. "Guy's been after the farm for 2 years. Dad kept saying no, but he spread his hands. Dad's not here anymore." I was standing at the counter with my back to them, refilling the carafe. My hands were steady, my chest wasn't. They didn't look at me when they said it. They hadn't looked at me much since the funeral. That was fine. Let them think I was just filling mugs. They had no idea the farm wasn't theirs to sell, and I had no intention of telling them. Not yet. Before I get to how that afternoon went, I need to back up, because this story doesn't start with a business card on a kitchen table. It starts 3 years earlier, with a man named Harold Beaumont, 143 acres of Kentucky bottomland, and a quiet understanding that grew between us when everyone else stopped showing up. Harold was my father-in-law. My husband Miles was his youngest son. Miles died 22 months before Harold. A cardiac event, fast, no warning. He was 34. I was 30. We had been married 5 years, and I had just earned my CPA license the spring before. The grief is something I don't talk about much. Not because it's gone, because it's mine. What I will say is this. After Miles died, Stuart and Rhett each called their father to offer condolences, and then they went back to their lives. Stuart, the oldest, ran a marketing firm in Nashville. Rhett did something in commercial real estate in Atlanta, which in retrospect explained a lot. They visited Harold twice a year at most, Christmas and whenever it was convenient. I kept going back to the farm, partly because Harold asked me to, mostly because he needed me to, and somewhere along the way because I needed it too. Harold was 71 when Miles died. He had a bad hip, a worse knee, and a stubbornness about doctors that could have been its own medical condition. He'd been running the Beaumont place, that 143 acres of bottomland in eastern Kentucky, since he was 26 years old. 3 generations of his family had worked that land. His grandfather had cleared the first 10 acres by hand. For the last 3 years of Harold's life, I drove out there every other weekend. 4 hours round trip from Lexington, where I worked. I brought groceries, scheduled his appointments, argued with his insurance company, sorted his medications into those weekly pill containers he hated. I learned how to read his blood pressure monitor and what numbers meant I should call his cardiologist instead of his regular doctor. I sat with him on the porch in the evenings and listened to him talk about the farm, what the land needed, what it had given him, what he hoped it would still be after he was gone. Stuart called once a month maybe, always on speakerphone, always under 15 minutes. Rhett sent a Christmas card. I'm not telling you this to make myself sound saintly. I'm telling you because it matters, to understand what Harold saw and what his sons didn't. Harold was sharp. He noticed who was there and who wasn't. He noticed who showed up and who sent a card. He noticed, and he remembered. About 8 months before he passed, Harold asked me to stay late one Saturday. It was October, already dark by 6. I'd helped him sort through a stack of bills, then made soup from a chicken he had in the freezer. After dinner, he asked me to sit at the table. He had a folder in front of him, thick, rubber-banded, the kind that lawyers and accountants produce. I noticed it but didn't say anything. I had a meeting with my attorney last month, he said, without telling anyone. Okay, I said. I want you to understand why before I show you what's in here. He put one hand flat on the folder and looked at me. Really looked at me, the way he did when he was being serious. Stuart and Rhett are not bad people. I need you to know I believe that. But they love what this land is worth more than what it is. There's a difference. Miles knew the difference. You know the difference. I didn't say anything. My throat felt tight. I'm putting the farm into an LLC, he said. Beaumont Land Holdings. I'm doing it while I'm still alive, while I'm still of sound mind. And the attorney has documented all of that carefully, because once I'm gone, I can't protect it anymore. Not unless I do this now. He opened the folder. Inside was a certificate of formation, an operating agreement, and a letter from his attorney explaining the transaction in plain language. He'd transferred the farm, the land, the equipment, the timber rights into the LLC 8 weeks prior. The filing date was stamped in blue ink. You're the managing member, he said, sliding the page toward me. Sole managing member, meaning you make the decisions. You control what happens to the land. I stared at the paper for a long time. Harold! I'm not giving you a gift, he said, because he knew what I was about to say. I'm giving the land a guardian. There's a difference there, too. The LLC didn't make me rich. That was never the structure. It meant I was the person with legal authority over the entity that owned the farm. The entity Harold had created himself, while alive, while competent. His sons would still receive assets from his estate, his savings account, his equipment fund, his life insurance payout. The farm itself had been moved out of the estate entirely, months before he died, by his own hand, with proper legal counsel. I talked to my attorney about this for 3 months before I signed anything, Harold said. She said it's solid. She said if Stuart and Rhett want to challenge it, they can try, but they won't find a crack. I asked if he was sure. I asked him twice. Celeste, he said, and his voice had that patient quality it got when he was done arguing. I'm 71, not blind. He died the following June, a Tuesday morning quietly in his own bedroom. I was at work when his neighbor called. I drove out that afternoon and stayed 3 days. Stuart and Rhett arrived the day of the funeral. They stayed at a hotel in town. I stayed at the house. The service was small. Harold hadn't wanted a fuss. Neighbors came. A few men from his hunting club, his pastor. People from the county who'd bought timber or hay from him over the years and wanted to pay their respects. Stuart and Rhett stood at the reception afterward, looking like men waiting for a meeting to start. I watched them across the room. Stuart's wife, Francesca, stood near the window checking her phone, barely glancing up when people offered condolences. Rhett kept looking at his watch. At one point, I walked close enough to hear them near the back hallway. Grayson's still interested, Rhett said, stirring a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. I talked to him last week. He'll give us a few months to sort out the estate. We should have the attorney move quickly, Stuart said. No reason to drag this out. She's going to be in the way, Rhett said quietly. And then, not quietly enough, she's the widow's widow at this point. Legally, she has no claim. The widow's widow. I carried those words home that night. I didn't sleep well, not because they stung. I'd put enough distance between myself and their approval that it didn't land the way it might have once. I didn't sleep because I kept thinking about Harold. About how he'd sat at that kitchen table and told me those boys love what this land is worth. He'd known. He'd known his sons, and he'd done something about it while he still could. The calls started the week after the funeral. Stuart called first, very professional, very measured. He wanted to schedule a time to go over the estate details and asked if I could be present since I'd been handling Harold's paperwork. I said of course. Rhett called 2 days later, less professional. He mentioned the Grayson offer and said the timing was sensitive, and he just wanted to make sure everyone was on the same page. I said I'd look forward to sitting down together. Then Francesca texted me, which surprised me, since we'd exchanged maybe 11 words in 5 years, to say she was thinking of me and to let her know if I needed anything. The warmth of it would have been touching if I had just watched her spend a funeral reception with her phone in her hand. I responded to all of them with some version of the same thing. I understand. Let's plan to talk soon. These things take a little time. They interpreted my calm as compliance. That was their first mistake. And it wasn't the first time someone had made it. We met at the farmhouse 2 Sundays later. I'd driven out the night before and stayed there. I wanted to wake up in Harold's house, drink coffee in his kitchen, walk the backfield before anyone arrived. I wanted to remember what we were actually talking about before the meeting started. The morning was clear. I walked the fence line along the east pasture as the sun came up. The grass was long. Harold's hired hand, a man named Bobby who'd worked the property for 11 years, had kept it mowed through June but wasn't sure what to do now that there was no one to pay him. I'd called Bobby myself the week Harold died and told him to keep going. I'd work something out. He'd paused on the phone for a long moment and then said, "Yes, ma'am," in a way that told me he'd been more worried about it than he'd let on. Stuart and Rhett arrived together at 11. No Francesca this time. They came in, looked around the kitchen, accepted the coffee I offered, and sat down on one side of the table. Rhett set a real estate folder down in front of him. I could see property comps inside it, an aerial photograph of the farm, handwritten margin notes. "So," Stuart said, looking around the kitchen with the particular gaze of someone calculating square footage. "We figured we'd start simple, get on the same page. The estate attorney thinks we can move through probate in about foursome, which puts us in good shape for a spring. The farm's not in the estate, I said. A pause. Stuart tilted his head. What do you mean? The farm isn't part of Harold's probate estate, I said. I kept my voice the same way I keep it when I'm explaining a tax situation to a client. Even clear, no editorializing. He transferred it into an LLC 8 months before he died. Beaumont Land Holdings, LLC. The transfer was completed and recorded last October. Rhett looked at Stuart. Stuart looked at me. That's not, Rhett started. He would have told us. He chose not to, I said. I reached beside my chair and picked up the folder I'd brought. Standard manila. Nothing dramatic. I slid it across the table between the coffee mugs. Everything's in there. The certificate of formation, the recorded deed, the operating agreement, the attorney's letter. Take those copies. I have originals. Neither of them moved to open it right away. They stared at it the way people stare at something when they're trying to will it into being different. Stuart opened it first. His eyes moved fast across the first page, slower on the second. His jaw tightened. He turned to the operating agreement, found my name, and stopped. You're the managing member, he said. Yes. Sole managing member. Yes. Rhett pulled the folder from him. He read faster, like speed might change the words. Then he looked up at me, and his expression had moved through confusion and arrived somewhere that wanted to be anger, but kept slipping into something closer to disbelief. He did this without telling us, Rhett said, flat, absorbing it. He did. You were out here every weekend. His voice had gone hard now. You had access to everything. He was sick, he was alone, and you had… Rhett. Stuart said his name like a warning. She was in his ear, Rhett said anyway. You can't tell me she didn't push him toward this. She's been running his accounts for years. She knew every… Your father's attorney has a letter on file, I said. My voice stayed level. I had expected this. It documents the nature of his decision-making, his mental competency at the time of the transfer, and the fact that I was not present at any of the meetings where the LLC was discussed or formed. Harold came to her independently. That's all documented. I paused. You're welcome to challenge it. That's your right. But I'd encourage you to speak with an attorney before you spend money on a case that your own attorney will likely tell you has no merit. The kitchen went quiet. The widow's widow, no legal claim. Harold had known. He'd built a wall around this land while he still could, and he'd handed me the authority over it. Not because I'd asked, not because I'd positioned myself for it, but because he'd watched me show up for 3 years and decided that showing up was what this land deserved. Stuart closed the folder. He didn't hand it back, he set it on the table between us. What are you going to do with it? He said, not angry anymore, tired. Keep it running, I said. Bobby is back at work. I'm applying for a cost-share program through the state agriculture office. Harold had been eligible for years and never applied. There's a timber stand on the east end that can be selectively harvested on a sustainable rotation. Income from that goes back into property maintenance and into a small fund Harold set up to ensure Bobby and 2 other workers stay employed. I looked at Stuart directly. Your father didn't want this land sold. He said so, clearly and often. I'm going to respect that. Rhett stood. He picked up his real estate folder, the one with the comps and the aerial photo, and walked out the front door without another word. A moment later, I heard his rental car start. Stuart sat for another minute. He looked around the kitchen again, but it was different this time, not calculating, just looking. He never told us anything, he said quietly. I wasn't sure if he meant the LLC or something larger. Maybe there was no difference. I know, I said. He left without finishing his coffee. I stood at the kitchen window and watched both cars back out of the gravel drive. Then there was just the ceiling fan clicking softly above the table. I washed the mugs, all 3 of them. I called Harold's attorney the next morning to tell her how it went. She said she wasn't surprised. She'd seen this before. People threaten legal action until they talk to someone who explains what it actually costs and what the odds actually are. She didn't hear from them, neither did I. Not from a lawyer, anyway. Stuart sent one email about 6 weeks later, no greeting, that said he hoped I knew what I was doing, and that if I ever reconsidered the land he'd appreciate being the first call. I didn't respond. A letter came to the farm in September, handwritten, blue ink, pressed a little too hard so the lines ran slightly uneven. It was from Bobby. He wrote that he wasn't sure how to say it right, but he wanted to thank me for calling him when I did. He'd been losing sleep over the job. He had a son starting his junior year of high school and a wife dealing with some health problems, and the farm work was what kept things steady. He said he took care of that land like it was his own, because in some ways it felt like it was. He'd been working there the same year Harold's youngest son got married. He remembered the wedding. He said Harold was a good man and he was glad the farm was in good hands. I read that letter at Harold's kitchen table. I read it twice. The second time I set it down and looked out the window at the east field, still summer green, the kind that doesn't last long. Harold had said, "I'm not giving you a gift, I'm giving the land a guardian." He was right about that too. I know there's a version of this story where I'm the villain, the scheming daughter-in-law who positioned herself close to a sick old man and locked his sons out. I know that's the version Rhett tells because it made its way back to me through Miles's cousin at a birthday party in October. Voices carry. I don't spend energy arguing with that version. Some people will always see what they need to see. What I know is this. Harold Beaumont made a decision with a clear mind, proper legal counsel, and full knowledge of what he was doing. He looked at the people around him, at who showed up and who didn't, at who knew the land and who knew its market value, and he made a choice. He protected something he loved from people who would have sold it without looking back. He chose right. Still drive out most weekends. It's still 4 hours round trip. Bobby waves from the equipment shed when I pull in. We have coffee, go over what needs doing. He knows the land better than I ever will, and I tell him so. He laughs every time, like I've said something funny. The East Timber Harvest begins in the spring. The state program came through. Harold would have had something grumbling to say about the paperwork involved, but he would have cashed the check. There's a kind of quiet that people mistake for having nothing to say. They see you at the kitchen counter filling mugs, and they decide you're filling a role, background, support, convenient. They stop seeing you as someone who might be 3 steps ahead. Harold taught me that. He was the quietest man I ever knew. He didn't argue. He didn't perform. He didn't waste words on people who had already made up their minds. He just built things that lasted. The land is still there. That was always the whole point.